Okay. Good afternoon, Excellencies, dear colleagues and dear guests. Good afternoon now again, and thank you very much for being here with us today. Myself, I would like to extend my warm compliments for the public that is following us live in live transmission, especially in Brazil. Bem-vindos a todos. Before we start this conference, I would like to convey my heartfelt sympathies for the families of the victims of the terrible floods that since yesterday have struck the state of Rio de Janeiro, especially the city of Petropolis, our imperial city, which up to the moment we count, unfortunately, 39 casualties. My dear colleagues, I'm very proud to be here today to open this colloquium, Don Pedro de Alcântara, the Monarch composer. With these symposiums, the permanent delegation of Brazil to the UNESCO, together with the Embassy of Brazil in France, and I thank my good friend and colleague, Ambassador Luis Fernando, to be here with us, inaugurates a series of events which will take place along the whole year to celebrate the bicentennial Brazil's independence, 1822-2022. Over the past 200 years, our country has come a long way from a sparsely populated agrarian colony based on slavery to a modern, vibrant, multicultural, and multiracial democracy. Many important challenges still lie ahead of us, but we cannot underestimate all that has been accomplished in the past 2 centuries. And the events that will be held throughout this year will try to present different aspects of this history. In our view, it is fitting that we start our celebrations from the beginning with the one man whose action set Brazil definitely on the path of independence, Don Pedro de Alcântara, the first emperor of Brazil. For this reason, we have invited for this colloquium a very distinguished team of specialists who will be speaking about Don Pedro, historic significance, his music, and the nomination of these musical archives to the Memory of the World program. With us here today, we have Faxon Banda, Chief of the Documentary Heritage Unit responsible for UNESCO Memory of the World program, Rosana Lancelote, harpist, chordist, musicologist, and director of the project Música Brasilis, Mauricio Vicente Ferreira Jr., director of the Imperial Museum in Petropolis, Rio de Janeiro, to whom I pledge my solidarity for the terrible events of yesterday and today. Mauricio Assumpção, journalist and researcher, author of the book, The History of Brazil in the Streets of Paris. And we will also have a pre-recorded intervention from David Kramer, professor from the University Nova of Lisboa. But before we pass the floor to our special guest, please allow me a few words on the subject of this colloquium. Brazil's independence was not the work of a single man, but the culmination of a long process started in the 18th century with the spread of the Enlightenment ideals. By the end of the century, local revolts against Portugal rule were already breaking out in different parts of the colony. However, it was actually under the Portuguese crown that Brazil has its first glimmer of independence. In 1807, fleeing invasion by Napoleon's troops, Don Juan, Prince Regent, and afterwards King of Portugal, decided to transfer his court to Brazil. Suddenly, Rio de Janeiro became the capital of the large Portuguese empire, which spread to Africa and Asia. When the Napoleonic Wars ended in 1815, and the great powers met in Vienna to redraw the maps of the world, the future of Brazil was also in question. What would become of Portugal's largest American colony? At first, on Talleyrand's suggestion, Don Juan decided to remain in Rio and adopted the formula: the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and Algarve, thereby elevated the colony to equal status with the mainland. But pressure for his return mounted in Portugal. In 1821, after a liberal revolution seized power in Porto, Don Juan decided to return, leaving the eldest son, Don Pedro de Alcântara, as Prince Regent in Brazil. On his departure, the Portuguese king is said to have instructed his son, if relations came to a breaking point, to seize the crown himself and put it on his head before some adventurer came up and does it. As relations between the colony and the mainland deteriorated rapidly, the young prince, who was only 22 at that time, embarked on the adventure of his life. Ordered by the Parliament of Lisbon to return to Portugal on 9th January 1822, Don Pedro responded firmly, "Fico," which means "I stay." That was Don Pedro's Rubicon. From then on, independence became inexorable, and it was Don Pedro himself who could proclaim it on 7 September with the famous word, independence of death, or death. There followed both independence and death, as troops stationed in Brazil, which remained loyal to Portugal, reinforced by Lisbon, fought those that remained loyal to the Prince Regent, who became Emperor of Brazil as Don Pedro I. By the end of 1823, war was won, both at land and at sea. On 29 August 1825, Portugal recognized Brazil's independence, and both countries signed a treaty of friendship. This friendship endures until present day, as we Brazilians strongly cherish the historical, cultural, and linguistic ties that bound both our countries together and now extend to the whole community of Portuguese-speaking countries, enriched by the diverse contribution of our African and Asian brothers in the CPLP. As emperor, Don Pedro's reign was not long, as he soon found himself in conflict with local political classes over the constitutional arrangements for the newborn nation. In November 1823, he dissolved the Constitutional Assembly and granted a constitution himself in 1824. A few months later, he overcame a separatist rebellion in the north of the country. Upon the death of his father, João VI, in 1826, Don Pedro inherited the Portuguese throne as King Pedro IV. But he soon abdicated in favor of his infant daughter, Dona Maria da Glória. Not, however, before granting Portugal a constitution as well, inspired by the Brazilian text. He also got entangled in a costly conflict with Argentina over the disputed territory of the east bank of the River Plate, which we call, in Brazil, we call the Cisplatina, and which became an independent country in 1828, Uruguay. In 1831, facing a liberal revolt in Brazil, Dom Pedro chooses to abdicate in favor of his son, Dom Pedro II, and return to Portugal to fight for the inheritance of his daughters against the ambitions of his brother Don Miguel. That war he also won, but after 2 years of battle, and just a few months afterwards, ruling as undisputed Prince Regent of Brazil, died of tuberculosis in 1834. He was only 35 years old. Don Pedro's life was like those of early romantics, too intense to be long and full of contradictions. He was born in Portugal to the ancient dynasty of Bragança, became Brazilian to give birth of a large tropical empire, then came back to die Portuguese in the same palace of Queluz, where he had been born in 1798. But he's now buried in Brazil, near Ipiranga, where he proclaimed independence. He inherited 2 crowns, religious both, as was still considered for 2 more political plots in Spain and Greece. A liberal prince, he was criticized in Brazil as an absolutist monarch, and then fought absolutism on the side of liberal in Portugal. He fought three major wars and won 2, where the odds were heaviest against him. He had 2 wives and won, and he loved them, at least for a time, but he was most passionate for his mistress, especially Marquis of Santos. It was, he said, an absent father. He nonetheless made his 2 children monarch of 2 different nations. But what was the greatest legacy of Dom Pedro? In a sense, Brazil's independence already existed in all but name during the years of his father, Dom João VI, because he ruled the empire from Rio de Janeiro. And the independence has not been proclaimed. If the independence had not been proclaimed by Dom Pedro in 1822, it will certainly have come sooner or later through the hands of, as quoted, some adventurer, in the words attributed to his father. The greatest legacy of Dom Pedro, no doubt, lies in Brazil's unity. A single country united by Portuguese language, comprising the immense American landmass that formerly belonged to the Portuguese crown, and that was his legacy more than anyone else, because it was he who embraces the project of a centralized constitutional monarchy proposed by José Bonifacio de Andrade Silva, to which he granted the legitimacy of his office as Prince Regent. He fought and won the War of Independence with scarce resources and rebellious troops at his disposal, and he would ensure the maintenance of Brazil's unity through his short but eventful reign. The unity outlived the empire he created, which ended in 1889. As we celebrate the bicentennial this year, the Brazilian territory that exists today as a federative republic is basically the one that he gave birth in 1822. Brazil's unity was, therefore, Dom Pedro's greatest legacy. It was not, however, his only one. And we are here today to talk about a different legacy, which has nothing to do either with politics or war, but which is music. Normally considered a not very learned character, especially when compared to his son, Dom Pedro II, a cultivated intellectual who knew 12 different languages, Dom Pedro was actually an accomplished musician. A pupil of Neukomm, himself disciplined disciple of Haydn, Don Pedro played the cello, the clarinet, and the bassoon, and was a composer on his own right. He loved music and was habitué at the Imperial Theater in Rio de Janeiro. When he came to Paris in 1831, as ex-emperor, he found time between plotting to overthrow his brother Don Miguel and raising an army to invade Portugal, to frequent two opera houses, to befriend Rossini, and to take dance lessons in order to shine in the balls of Louis Philippe court. He even had a piece premiered in the Opera of the Italians, conducted by Rossini. It was Don Pedro who composed Brazilia's independence anthem, which is familiar to all Brazilians and continued to be chanted in official celebration, but not many people know he was the author. And his music legacy is hardly known outside specialized circles. This is a pity, for as you will see, so listen to some excerpt that will be presented in this colloquium. Don Pedro music was hardly amateurish, which puts him in the company of other known monarch composers such as Alfonso X of Spain, Frederick the Great of Prussia, and Prince Johann Ernest of Saxe-Weimar. It is for this reason that as we work on both sides of the Atlantic for rehabilitation of Don Pedro's musical legacy, Brazil has decided to present the nomination of the documental archives of Don Pedro's musical scores to be inscribed in the memory of the World Program. Brazil highly regards the memory of the World Program, as we believe it is our memory that shape our identities, and our identities that make us people and nations. As we share those memories that we consider to be of universal value, we also help to weave the larger fabric of the global identity that comprises the whole international community. This is the vocation of UNESCO and the main purpose of the different registers, such as the World Heritage List or the representative list of intangible cultural heritage of humanity. Brazil has already inscribed 10 collections in the memory of the World Program, including the musical score of Antonio Carlos Gomes, Brazil's greatest composer in the 19th century. And we will be very glad also to add to the collection Don Pedro de Alcântara, the monarch composer, to this register. But if you allowed me, before closing this introduction, I will just like to say one more word about Brazil's other nomination to the Memory of the World Program presented for this year, which is of equal importance to us, the collection Feminist Science and Politics, Berta Lutz's Legacy. Daughter of Adolfo Lutz, one of Brazil's most renowned epidemiologists and a pioneer in the fight against yellow fever, Berta Lutz was also a scientist important in the field of botany and zoology. But she was also an activist for women's rights and founded in 1922 the Brazilian Federation for Women's Progress, and she championed the cause of gender equality and as educator and as a politician, and became the second Brazilian woman to hold a seat in parliament in 1936. The vote for women granted in Brazil in 1932 was among her important conquests, but her efforts were much beyond women's suffrage. In 1945, she took part in the Conference of San Francisco, which drafted the UN Charter, and was one of the only 4 women to sign it. She is credited, together with the Dominican delegate Minerva Bernardino, for the phrases in the preamble and Article 8 of the Charter, which recognize the equality between men and women. You will be hearing more about Berta Lutz during this year as we progress in the celebration of the bicentennial. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I will now pass the floor to our first speaker, Faxon Banda, Chief of the Documentary Heritage Unit, who will speak about the Memory of the World Program. Mr. Banda, our host from UNESCO Secretary today, is one of our most important collaborators in the communication and information sector, and we are very glad that he accepted our invitation to speak in this colloquium. Mr. Banda, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Needless to say, I'm so glad to join you in this celebration. I accepted this invitation to do one thing, and I hope that this will be the takeaway message from my presentation. It is that the Memory of the World program is much more than just the register. That's the argument I want to make this afternoon, important though the register is. So to help me do that, I will structure my remarks, first of all, in terms of the key objectives that underpin the Memory of the World program. Secondly, by giving you a sample of the activities that we undertake in between nomination cycles for the register. And finally, I will indicate the key strategic directions in which we are moving. Hopefully, by the end of that, you will have had a clearer idea of what it is we do. So in terms of the objectives, to begin with, the program was set up in 1992 as a vehicle, first of all, to identify documentary heritage, which is defined in the general guidelines of the program, but also to preserve it, and thirdly, to enhance universal access to it. More importantly for us, in 2015, member states resolved to adopt the recommendation concerning the preservation of and access to documentary heritage, including in digital form. What this recommendation does is to set out a normative and programmatic framework within which we operate. It is important to understand this in terms of the 5 key areas of intervention that are encapsulated therein. You will notice that the first 3, identification, preservation, and access in yellow, speak to the objectives of the Memory of the World program. And then the last 2, cooperation policy, can better be understood in terms of enabling environments. So we can identify, preserve, and access documentary heritage in an environment of effective policy. So also can we do that in an environment of national and international cooperation. So the other 2 indeed are enablements. they are an enabling environment for what we do. An important point to make with respect to this recommendation, especially for the benefit of all the member states that may be here, is that we will be launching the second round of consultations, which will lead to member states reporting on the implementation of this recommendation in the last 4 years. And so I want to take this opportunity to appeal to you all to take this endeavor as seriously as possible. During the first round, we had some 38 member states reporting, and would like to increase that number as much as possible because it is an indicator of how member states are taking on the provisions of the recommendation. Having said that then, let me indicate to you a few activities that we carry out as part of the Memory of the World program. Very, very quickly, we undertake workshops, most of them focused on policy, on capacity building, and so on and so forth. We have publications, and so far this year, or at least late last year, we launched 2 publications, one focusing on digitization in low-cost environments, which is truly useful, particularly with COVID. Digitizing documentary heritage enables enhanced access in restrictive environments, and another one that focuses on preservation in general terms. And yes, indeed, we also do give a prize, notably the UNESCO JIGG Memory of the World Prize, that recognizes excellence in documentary heritage preservation. And we have just issued a call for nominations. This prize is about encouraging individuals and organizations. So it's not about collections as such. It is about individuals and organizations and the efforts they put into the 3 objectives of the Memory of the World program. Research and education is also a key feature of what we are involved in. And yes, I put this last, the Memory of the World International Register, established in 1995, is indeed a key ingredient of what we do as Memory of the World program. And speaking about that, obviously, you know that we are now in the 2022-2023 nomination cycle, and the process is unfolding in that regard. So having given you a sampling of the activities, let me then indicate the key strategic directions in which we are moving. The first one, obviously, is continued support for member states' implementation of the 2015 recommendation. And in doing this, we try to work with our network of national and regional committees of the Memory of the World program, because these serve as implementation vehicles for the recommendation. And for those member states that do not have these yet in place, that is national committees, I would urge you to consider that. Secondly, we aim at strengthening national, regional, and international cooperation, and we have several activities in that regard. For instance, we have had interregional conferences in 2018 in Panama City, another one in the Republic of Korea in 2019, and Azerbaijan has risen to the challenge and will host the third one in 2023 in Baku. Many other member states are at liberty to bring themselves forward in terms of taking this agenda forward. Thirdly, we have been giving support in as far as upstream preservation policies are concerned among member states. And one of the activities that we've been organizing has to do with the Global Policy Forum on Disaster Risk Reduction for Documentary Heritage. We have had 2 so far, highly successful, providing a platform for experts to speak about what it means to use disaster risk reduction as a framework, as a strategic framework for preserving and accessing documentary heritage. And we have entered into a cooperation with several organizations, not least the Digital Preservation Coalition. As part of that, we are also involved in downstream capacity building for digitization among memory institutions. For example, in Ivory Coast, in Djibouti, the Jigji Prize is also used for that. We are also moving into Mali and Sudan, assisting with that as well. Fourthly, we are also enhancing strategic partnerships to enhance the utility value of documentary heritage as sustainable development. In other words, there is a shift from access as such to exploitation, to usability, to utility. And that is important because within that framework, you can enter all sorts of strategic partnerships, such as we have done, for example, with Google Arts and Culture, to showcase the educational value of documentary heritage. Also, in terms of the digital environment, with INRIA, a French computing organization, we are working on software source code as documentary heritage. With the National Archives Administration of China on disaster preparedness for documentary heritage, and so on and so forth, especially in the face of COVID-19. And the fifth strategic direction is, of course, increasing the number of inscriptions from underrepresented regions of the world, including Africa and small island developing states, on the Memory of the World International Register. You can see from that table that Africa, registers 5%, the Arab states 2%, the lowest. If you move on to Latin America and the Caribbean, we've got 18% there, 93 in absolute terms, with Brazil accounting for 10 of those and in counting. And therefore, that indicates to us that there is a lot more work to be done. And so having a forum such as this one serves as a platform for me to amplify the Secretariat's voice in encouraging those member states from underrepresented regions to consider working with us in terms of capacity building, in terms of consultations with memory institutions, in terms of engaging experts so that they can strategically identify items of documentary heritage that could have potential universal significance and therefore fitting for inscription on the Memory of the World International Register. It is fitting then that I end on that note. But in the end, as I said at the beginning, the key message for me is there is much more to the Memory of the World program than just the register. The register is a means to everything else that I've said. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now, I will invite Rosana Lanzerot to speak about the music of Dom Pedro de Alcântara. As creator and director of Música Brasilis project, Ms. Lancelot carries out a remarkable work in the collection and the recording of Brazilian classical music. Her knowledge and assistance were crucial not only for the preparation of this colloquium, but most especially for the preparation of this nomination. You have the floor, Madam Lancelot. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to start by thank you, Ambassador Santiago Mourão and all his team for having organized and hosted this conference. I'm especially happy to celebrate Dom Pedro de Alcântara, our monarch composer, a great man, a liberal, that has used his music skills to promote globally both Portugal and Brazil. let's talk a little about his background. Dom Pedro was a descendant of the Braganza dynasty, and several of his ancestors had a special connection with music. One may point out King John IV, that reigned at the beginning of the 17th century. He was himself a composer and gathered the largest music collection of Europe in his time. Unfortunately, this collection has been destroyed by the Lisbon earthquake in 1755. Another antecessor of Dom Pedro was King John V, that reigned at the beginning of the 18th century. At his time, Portugal became the richest court in Europe due to the gold that came from Brazil. He was then able to build Mafra, the palace and the convent, considered nowadays the most important Baroque monument in Portugal. He was also able to import prominent musicians. Among them, the most noticeable is Domenico Scarlatti, that became his daughter's music teacher, Dona Bárbara. Another antecessor of Dom Pedro, his father, Dom João, who was the grandson of Dom João V, he would become the sixth later, has chosen Mafra as his preferred residence. During his regency from 1792 on, 6 organs were built in the church, the only such example so far. Dom João was very keen of music and had at Mafra the company of Marcos Portugal, the most celebrated Portuguese composer at that time. Marcos has written several works for the 6 organs, and these manuscripts belong nowadays to Mafra's outstanding library. As our ambassador has already told you, at 1807, the Portuguese court went to Rio to escape Napoleon invasion. One of the first acts of Dom João, still a prince Dom João at that time, 3 months after his arrival in Rio, he has created the Royal Chapel for greater splendor of the liturgy. The Royal Chapel was an institution that should provide music and all the needs of liturgical services. As chapel master, he designed José Maurício Nunes Garcia, the most important Brazilian composer of his time. One can also notice the increase of musicians and singers coming to Rio at the time Dom João was regent and then king. As he was very fond of music, he imported several European musicians, all paid with his own resources, in Portuguese, o real bolsinho. In this table, you can notice the increasing number of instrument players and singers arriving in Rio. And a special number of them come as a consequence of the Vienna Congress and the creation of the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and Algarves. This has an enormous impact in the development of the country with the arrival of artists, scientists, and diplomats. The Portuguese court was very fond of opera. When Dom João comes to Rio, there was Teatro Régio, but he considered it not good enough for the opera he would like to listen to. So he started the construction of Real Teatro São João, that is inaugurated in 1813. You can see in this table which operas were staged in Rio in that period. And you can notice that Rossini was the most popular composer so far. This is the context of Dom Pedro being raised and educated. Of course, it's the background of his music skills. And he had, as one of his main music teachers, because he had several, he played 12 instruments, as our ambassador said, and he had Marcos Portugal, which was a very good opera composer, as his teacher, as well as his sisters. For the music lessons, Marcos transcribed arias from his operas. You can see in this manuscript belonging to the Imperial Museum, fortunately, an aria dedicated to Dom Pedro by the hand of Marcos Portugal. So now let us talk about Dom Pedro de Alcântara, the composer. He lived not many years, but he could let us a number of his compositions. So I divide this discussion in 4 groups. Amazingly, Dom Pedro has started his composition métier by writing waltzes. In 1816, he had a new music teacher because Sigismund Neukomm, the Austrian composer, had arrived in Rio after the French artist mission, and he was then the new teacher of Dom Pedro, and he mentions in his catalog 6 waltzes written by Dom Pedro, both dated November 1816. Well, unfortunately, this manuscript have not been located. But by this time, Dom Pedro knew he would marry Princess Leopoldina, the daughter of the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph. The waltz genre became very popular after the Vienna Congress, after which it spread all over Europe. So perhaps Dom Pedro wrote these pieces to please his future wife. Princess Leopoldina was also a distinguished pianist. She was a descendant of the Habsburg dynasty, and when she goes to Rio, she brings an important music collection. You can see here a cover page of a concert that has been dedicated to her by her former master in Vienna, Kogello. And this is the only copy that exists in the world. 1 month after she arrives, she writes to her sister Maria Luisa, which was Napoleon's wife. I am especially busy with music that my husband loves passionately. And probably she was an inspiration for Dom Pedro musician. The second group of pieces are the anthems that had obviously political motivations. The first known anthem was written in Rio in honor of his father Dom João, May 1817. The words say, "For you, for the country, the blood we'll give. By glory we only have to win or to die." At that time, the Portuguese were fighting the revolution at Pernambuco, and probably this anthem is also motivated by this fact. Another anthem composed by Dom Pedro, the constitutional anthem 1821, that has become the national Portuguese anthem until the proclamation of the Republic in 1910. The independence anthem in 1822, one of our most popular anthems, we all love to sing it. You can see here the manuscript of the orchestral version belonging to the Historical and Geographic Institute in Brazil. And probably his last piece, the new constitutional anthem, written in 1832 when he was traveling to Lisbon to liberate the country, his country, Portugal, from his absolutist brother, Dom Miguel. There is an important thing to notice. The first two anthems are written in E-flat major. Few people know that at that time, several composers were Freemasons, and they used some musical symbology to signify their association with Freemasonry. And one of the distinct signs was E-flat major key signature, the three flats symbolizing the perfect trinity, and also the three grades within the Masonic Lodge. So the first two hymns in this relation are in E-flat major. A third group of pieces was written for the church. 4 autograph manuscripts have survived and belong to the Rio de Janeiro Cathedral's archive. We are going to hear now an example of the excerpt of Credo, which is one of Dom Pedro's most played pieces. Thank you. You probably noticed the intervention of the clarinet. I didn't mention that before, but the clarinet was one of the most special instruments for the Freemasons. And Dom Pedro himself played the clarinet. The last group of pieces relate to secular music. We know that Dom Pedro has written an overture, and Mauricio Assunção is going to talk more about that, a march, and a divertissement. Leopoldina writes to her father in 1821, "My husband, who is also a composer, sends you a solemn mass, a symphony, and a Te Deum of his own authorship. Honestly speaking, it's a bit theatrical, which is its author's fault, but I guarantee that it was composed by him without any help." Northern Europeans were very surprised by music style practice in the royal chapel. In Northern Europe, church music is always solemn and sad, but in the Portuguese court, the church was also a place to celebrate. And consequently, in Brazil, music for the church could be joyful with operatic tones. There is a letter where Neukomm writes to a friend in Europe, Don John, the king, loves the Gloria of the Mass. So I have written a Mass where the Gloria lasts 1 hour. So the Gloria is obviously the most joyful moment of the Mass. Well, I'm very happy to be here again to celebrate our Monarch composer in company of good friends and important researchers. And some of the pieces I mentioned here are available at Música Brasília's website that I created in 2009. And they will they'll be worked and recorded and played by several orchestras in Brazil this year. I thank also UNESCO that cooperates with Música Brasília, Instituto Camões that enabled the research of Dom Pedro's works in Açores, which will be the subject of David Kramer's talk, and also the sponsoring of Vale in BNDES. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosada. Thank you very much. Now we will watch a pre-recorded intervention from Professor David Kramer from Universidade Nova in Lisbon. Unfortunately, Professor Kramer could not be here with us today, but he's one of the main researchers who worked painstakingly on the rehabilitation of Dom Pedro's musical score. He will speak about the sources and editions of the works of Dom Pedro. Let's watch the video. Okay.
Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to take part in this afternoon's conference. I'm only sorry not to be able to be with you all in person, not least because I'd like to be able to hear my colleagues speak. Before I begin, I would just like to take this opportunity to thank all those that have made this event possible. The members of Brazil's permanent delegation to UNESCO, Ambassador Santiago Mourão, and Minister Councillor André Chemon de Lima, and particularly my colleague and friend Rosanna Lancelot, who has so ably put this event together. I would also like to thank the Camões Institute in Brasilia, which made possible my research visits to Porto Angra do Heroísmo, the results of which you will hear during this talk. So let me just share my PowerPoint and then I can begin. Sources and editions of the works of Dom Pedro I of Brazil, Dom Pedro IV of Portugal. Considering that Dom Pedro de Alcântara was first and foremost a prince, emperor and king at a time of political instability, it is unsurprising that his output as a composer was necessarily limited. And yet, though few, the exact number of works that he composed remains difficult to define. For example, different sources make reference to up to 3 settings of the hymn Te Deum Laudamus, distinguished by their date of composition, but we have music for only one of them. This immediately begs the question as to whether there were in fact more, or whether this disparity merely reflects confusion over the date of composition of the Te Deum that we do possess. Further clouding the question, on the one hand, there are certain attributions that would seem to be based more on fantasy than documentation, while on the other, we cannot preclude the possibility of discovering unknown works whose attribution there is no reason to doubt. I shall return to this vexed issue at the end of my presentation. For the present purposes, I shall limit the scope of my study largely to works for which we have reliable sources, most of which have been recovered and are available in modern editions. I have based this primarily on the work list by Alberto José Vieira Pacheco from his entry in the online biographical dictionary of the Caravella Study Group for the History of Luso-Brazilian Music. This, in turn, is closely mirrored in the online site of Música Brasilis, an essential resource for both sources and editions, of which Alberto Pacheco is a collaborator. He has also made substantial use of two other important texts. The first is Dom Pedro Rei Imperador e Músico by the late Portuguese maestro Manuel Ivo Cruz, written for the catalogue of an exhibition at Queluz Palace in 1986. Manuel Ivo Cruz was for decades one of the very few people interested in the musical aspect of Dom Pedro, collecting early sources and photocopies as far as he was able, now available from the library of the Catholic University in Oporto. The second text is the book O Som Social, published privately in São Paulo in 2011 by Lino de Almeida Cardoso, a Brazilian social historian whose focus is on music, power and society in Brazil in the 18th and 19th centuries, and particularly in Rio de Janeiro. As we see from these bibliographical references, and as we will also see with regard to the sources, interest and distribution are on both sides of the Atlantic, underlying how important Dom Pedro was musically as well as politically, as much in Portugal as in Brazil. The fundamentally transatlantic nature of Dom Pedro is apparent even in his musical training. Though he certainly benefited from support from Sigismund Neukomm between 1816 and 21, and possibly from Father José Mauricio Nunes Garcia at some point between 1808 and 1811, his principal teacher, and the only one for which we have direct primary source evidence, was the Portuguese Marques Portugal. Internationally renowned as a composer of Italian opera, he arrived in Rio de Janeiro coming from Lisbon in June 1811 and died in Rio in February 1830. We possess autographed scores of 5 operas by Marques Portugal in arrangements for voice and piano, prepared explicitly for Dom Pedro, a solo from Artaserse, and 4 duets for him and his elder sister, Prince Maria Isabel, 3 from Loro non compra amore, and 1 from La Madre Virtuosa. The first of these is now housed at the Imperial Museum Petropolis, the other 4 at the Portuguese National Library. So let us come to the main point of this presentation, the sources and editions of Dom Pedro's own compositions. In very broad terms, these may be divided into 2 groups: works of an overtly political or dynastic nature, and sacred works, though I would argue that these 2, in most cases, have political or dynastic undertones, or both. In the first group, we should include the 4 anthems, or hinos in Portuguese, and the Marche Imperial or Imperial March. The earliest of the hinos, for chorus and full orchestra, is conserved in a single source at the Portuguese National Library, and formerly belonged to the musicologist Ernesto Vieira. Dated 20th of May 1817, exactly a week after Dom Pedro's marriage by proxy in Vienna, and a week after King João VI's birthday, its text in praise of the king is seen as an act of homage on Dom Pedro's part, and has led to its being known as the Hino de Dom João. By far the best known and widely disseminated of the anthems was the Hino Constitucional or Hino da Carta. Composed in 1821 in celebration of the recently approved Portuguese constitution, in due course it became the Portuguese national anthem up until the Republican Revolution of 1910. Unsurprisingly, there are many sources, both early ones in manuscript and later printed editions. Among the manuscripts, for example, are one conserved at the Évora Public Library and another at the Portuguese National Library with a piano reduction attributed to Marques Portugal, once again formerly belonging to Ernesto Vieira. Among the many printed editions are 2 published in Paris, one by Antonio Pacini and the other by A. Petitbon. The first has been dated 1826 by the Portuguese National Library, presumably on the basis that a second constitution was signed that year. But since Dom Pedro is described on the title page solely as the Duque de Bragança, it must have postdated his abdication as Emperor of Brazil in 1831. The Petitbon edition in French translation, with the title Roi, Peuple et Soldats et Patrie, specifically mentions that the edition se vend au profit des réfugiés portugais, sold for the profit of the Portuguese refugees. Thus, the proposed dating of 1828 by the Bibliothèque Nationale de France is appropriate, since it was in that year that many Portuguese fled to Paris and London as a result of the usurpation of the Portuguese throne by Dom Miguel, Pedro's brother. There were also editions that year in London. It was published as an appendix in the Reverend William Morgan Kinsler's book, Portugal Illustrated in a Series of Letters, and also in a separate sheet music edition by I. Willis and Company, with the title Viva Viva, the Hymn of the Portuguese Constitutionalists, written and composed by His Majesty Dom Pedro, Emperor of the Brazils, the words translated by W. Ball, the music arranged by B.G.H. Gibson. Alberto Pacheco also makes reference to an arrangement for solo piano by the German composer Ferdinand Bayer and a set of variations for piano by Charles Benet. A third anthem, the Hino à Independência do Brasil, also known as the Hino Imperial or Hino Constitucional, remains to this day an official anthem in Brazil. The oldest known source in a manuscript is a manuscript in the Instituto Histórico e Geográfico Brasileiro in Rio de Janeiro. Though some commentators have dated it to the 7th of September 1822, the day when Dom Pedro declared Brazilian independence, there is no evidence that this was the date of composition, and most researchers would propose a slightly later date. A fourth anthem, known as the Hino Novo Constitucional or Hino da Amélia, or even simply as Hino de Dom Pedro IV, is believed to date from 1832, while Dom Pedro was on board the corvette Amélia on his way to or already in the Azores Islands, preparing to retake Portugal from his brother by military force. The manuscript conserved at the Portuguese National Library also attests to its being composed aboard corvette Amélia. There's a comment at the bottom of the title page. It became well known in the 19th century and was published in 1893 by César das Neves in the first of the 3 volumes that make up his Cancioneiro das Músicas Populares. He also tells us that it was played systematically in Brazil on festive occasions relating to Dom Pedro. Lastly, among the overtly political or dynastic works is the Marcha Imperial, which the only surviving source for clarinet and piano duet is at the Portuguese National Library. The rather curious scoring suggests that this is probably an arrangement of what was originally a work composed for a military band with or without orchestral strings, and with an obbligato clarinet part. The clarinet was indeed extremely popular in Brazil from soon after the arrival of the Portuguese royal family in 1808 and during succeeding decades. All of the anthems, as well as the Imperial March, have been edited by Alberto Pacheco and published by Musica Brasilis. If we turn now to the sacred music, while not in any sense wishing to cast doubt on their sincerity as works of faith, I would suggest that in almost all cases their composition also served dynastic or political purposes. I earlier mentioned the existence of references to 3 versions of Te Deum Laudamus by Dom Pedro, probably all relating to the single one for which we have a source. This is an autograph manuscript housed at the Metropolitan Chapter of Rio de Janeiro Cathedral and dated 12th of October 1820, the composer's birthday. On the title page, there is a dedication to King João VI, which terminates with a curious comment, per o nascimento, for the birth. Alberto Pacheco suggests very plausibly that it was composed in preparation for the birth of Prince Juan Carlos, which occurred on the 9th of March the following year. The baptism of the heir to the throne took place on the 27th of March and was reported in the official newspaper, the Gazeta do Rio de Janeiro, on the 31st. With regard to the Te Deum sung on that occasion, it states, "Then the very reverend bishop intoned the hymn Te Deum, which was sung by the musicians of the Royal Chapel, Chamber and Chapel, with music composed by a transcendent genius, as beloved of the Muses as of the Portuguese, directed by the celebrated Marquis de Portugal, Master of their Royal Highnesses." As befits such a dynastic occasion, the work is magnificent in its conception for a four-part choir, soloists and full orchestra, including a trombone and timpani. It is generally accepted that an overture of Dom Pedro's composition, which he conducted in Paris on the 28th of October 1831 and was applauded by the public and met with Joaquino Rossini's approval, originally belonged to this Te Deum. Manuel Ivo Cruz performed it in 1986, using an edition based on a score in the possession of the House of Palmela, unfortunately not present in his collection in Oporto. It is, however, apparently the same as an overture in the archive of the Lira Sanjoanense in São João del Rei, Brazil, on which a transcription in the library of the late musicologist Cleofe Persson de Matos is presumably based. The other surviving large-scale sacred work is a mass known as the Missa ad honorem Leonis Duodecimi. There are three surviving sources for this mass, though only one of them is complete. The Alberto Nepomuceno Library at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro's Music School has a manuscript score lacking the solo parts. The Metropolitan Chapter in Rio has an autograph score entitled Credo do Imperador, the Emperor's Credo, consisting of the Credos Sanctus and Benedictus and Annus Dei. Only the copy at the Cathedral Archive of Angra do Heroísmo on the Azorian island of Terceira is complete. This was discovered and subsequently recorded under the direction of Father Duarte Gonçalves Rosa. Its score is identical to that of the Te Deum. To judge from the title, Mass in Honour of Leo XII, it must have been composed to celebrate the election of Cardinal Annibale de la Genga as Pope Leo XII on the 28th of September 1823, little over a month after the death of his predecessor, Pope Pius VI. The news of the election only reached Rio de Janeiro in mid-December, so the likely date of composition is between late 1823 and 1824. It would be ingenuous of us to suppose that this dedication was not politically motivated. Less than 2 years after Dom Pedro's unilateral declaration of independence for Brazil, it would have been important to the new emperor to have the political support of the papacy. Although there is no known source for it, Dom Pedro evidently composed an earlier Mass, which was performed together with his Te Deum under Father José Maria Nunes Garcia's direction in September 1821, as reported in the Gazeta do Rio de Janeiro on the 21st of that month. Metropolitan Chapter of Rio Cathedral also preserves two shorter compositions using the same musical resources as the two works described above. The first of these is a set of 3 responds for St. Pedro de Alcântara's Day, celebrated on the 19th of October each year, exactly a week after Dom Pedro's birthday. Considering that he wrote no response for any other day in the liturgical year, we have to conclude that his choice was dynastically motivated, glorifying himself by enabling his name day to be celebrated in the imperial chapel with music of his own composition. The other work, bound together in the same volume with the St. Pedro de Alcântara response, is the Marian hymn or antiphon Sub Tuum Presidium. Liturgically versatile, but particularly associated with the Compline canticle Nunc Dimittis, its text, calling on the Virgin Maria's protection, is striking within the political frictions with which Dom Pedro had to contend. And I quote, "Beneath thy protection we take refuge, Holy Mother of God. Do not despise our prayers in our necessity, but from all dangers always free us, O glorious and blessed Virgin." Musica Brasilis has published modern editions of all of the sacred works, the Te Deum, Missa ad honorem Leonis Duodecimi, and Subtuum Presidium, transcribed by Antonio Campos, the St. Pedro de Alcântara Responds, and the Overture, transcribed by Jean-Isaac Marx. On the ISMLP site, there are also modern editions of Subtuum Presidium and the Te Deum Overture, transcribed by Rafael Salas Arantes. The first of these, published in 2015, is curious in that the transposing instruments indicate their respective transpositions in the full score, but are written at actual pitch, that is to say, untransposed. The overture, edited in 2020, brings this idiosyncrasy in line with normal practice, that is to say, with the transposing instruments transposed. Rafael Salas Arantes is apparently also responsible for one of the more fanciful attributions, the so-called Hino da Maçonaria, or Masonic Anthem. The piece in question appears in a publication entitled Coleção de Hinos Brasileiros, published around 1900 by the Casa Artur Napoleão in Rio de Janeiro, where it has neither an attribution nor a text. The editor supplies both, but provides no evidence for either. We must suppose the attribution to be spurious. On the other hand, we can never exclude the possibility of hitherto unknown works appearing, or musical sources being found for works that we currently know of only from references. My own research led to the discovery of a short sacred work bound in with the Missa ad honorem Leonis Duodecimi, the whole volume of which is attributed to Dom Pedro. It is an a cappella mass for Ash Wednesday, consisting of just the Kyries, Sanctus and Benedictus, and Agnus Dei, and the tract versicle Adjuva nos Deus. Evidently penitential in intention, the upper part throughout is based on a tone, with a simple homophonic accompaniment in stila antico in the other three parts. Let me just come out of the PowerPoint. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, there are a few other works that can plausibly be attributed to Dom Pedro, and in his dictionary entry, Alberto Pacheco, with due critical caution, provides such evidence as there is for these attributions. Like him, I have been unable to trace any sources for them, and therefore I haven't spoken about them. And to conclude, let us then just listen to a short extract from the Missa ad honorem Leonis Duodecimi, the opening of the Credo. Thank you very much.
I thank you very much, Professor Kramer. Now I invite Mauricio Assunção to take the floor in order to speak us about the short but eventful month spent by our then ex-emperor in Paris of Rossini. He will share with us some interesting stories about Don Pedro and the cultural context of those times. Mr. Assunção, the floor is yours.
Here we go. Boa tarde, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank the Ambassador Santiago Mourão and the Brazilian delegation at UNESCO, as well as Dr. Rosana Lanzelot, for the invitation to be here talking about Dom Pedro of Brazil and Portugal. I would just click on here. Yeah, everything is in place for this presentation. Right, the first question is, what was Dom Pedro doing in Paris? What was this ex-emperor of Brazil doing in Paris and not in Portugal? Most people in Brazil ignore that Dom Pedro spent 6 months of his short life in France, simply because this part of his life is not considered Brazilian history anymore. It's more like Portuguese history. And that's exactly what makes Dom Pedro's life so fascinating. He's a fundamental historical figure in 2 countries, in 2 different continents, just like his French hero, the Marquis de Lafayette. After abdicating the Brazilian throne in 1831, Dom Pedro could not go back to Portugal, where his brother had become king in a coup d'etat, seizing the throne that was reserved to Maria da Glória, Dom Pedro's daughter. So leaving Brazil, Dom Pedro, his wife, the Empress Amelia, and his daughter crossed the Atlantic Ocean to arrive in Cherbourg, Normandy, in the 2nd week of June 1831. Funny enough, he did not meet Louis Philippe, the king of the French, until July 26. The question is, why? Why did he take nearly 6 weeks to meet the king and the French politicians who could try to help him in his mission to rescue the Portuguese throne from the hands of Dom Miguel, his tyrant brother? Well, if you look at the historical alliance between Portugal and the United Kingdom, it was clear that Dom Pedro expected to find support, first of all, among the British politicians. Indeed, he was very welcomed by King William IV, but the Whigs, who had just won the election for the British Parliament, were not willing to show support for Dom Pedro's plan to invade Portugal. The fear was that this kind of direct intervention in the Portuguese affairs could lead to friction with the Holy Alliance of Russia, Prussia, and the Austrian Empire, who were very much inclined to support Dom Miguel. And that's when Dom Pedro meets Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, the French ambassador to London, the man who survived all revolutions. And it's Talleyrand who insists Dom Pedro should seek King Louis Philippe in Paris as soon as possible. And here we have one of my favorite cartoons in the whole history. So I'm going to show for you. I'm not connected there, Mr. Technician. Oh, there we are. Okay. So this is a 1831 cartoon by Honoré Daumier in a newspaper, in a Parisian newspaper called Le Rire. And it represents perfectly the geopolitical situation in Europe at the time. And what we see on my right-hand side is Dom Pedro, who is willing to get the crown from his brother on the left-hand side, Dom Miguel. And behind Dom Pedro, we have a man with a top hat, which actually King Louis Philippe, because he was the king bourgeois. And on the on my left-hand side, we see the Holy Alliance of the Austrian Empire, Russia, and Prussia supporting Dom Miguel, who are more conservative and absolutist. So I think, in my opinion, this is one of the best cartoons ever in Brazilian, or actually, this is more like Portuguese history than Brazilian history. But because we like so much Dom Pedro in Brazil, we always consider his life part of Brazilian history. So there we go. What happened to Dom Pedro once he was in Paris? Dom Pedro was welcomed by the king and by the French people as a liberal monarch who had abdicated his throne in defense of the Brazilian constitution. That was the image Dom Pedro liked to project of himself, although we know that his authoritarian temperament was one of the main reasons why he lost political support in Brazil and consequently was forced to renounce. But now in Paris, Dom Pedro was the exotic emperor from the tropics, the romantic hero who was ready to sacrifice his life to rescue the Portuguese crown for his daughter Maria da Glória, the legitimate heiress of the Portuguese kingdom. It's a shame that, despite this positive image, the French government refused to help Dom Pedro just like the British did. Once again, neutrality was the word of the day, and the French didn't want to get in trouble with the Holy Alliance. If anything, the best the French could do was to close their eyes and pretend that Dom Pedro was not assembling a fleet of war vessels and recruiting an army of mercenaries inside the French territory. Still, as a gesture of kindness and friendship, King Louis-Philippe offered Dom Pedro and his family the Château de Meudon as a provisional accommodation. The family, however, occupied the place for no more than 2 months. The chateau was massive, but it was cold and quite far from Paris. As soon as he could, Dom Pedro moved his family to a house he rented at Rue de Courcelles, just behind the church of Saint-Philippe du Roule, in one of the most prestigious neighborhoods in Paris. It was in that house, still there today, that he would organize meetings to raise money and plan the invasion of Portugal. But life in Paris was not all about war. It was also about entertainment and family life. In the 19th century, Paris was by far the most exciting city in the world. And Dom Pedro, brought up in Rio de Janeiro, that remote land in South America, was looking forward to experience life in full. Opera, theater, concerts, art exhibitions. Dom Pedro, his pregnant wife, and his children could be seen everywhere. About his children, it's worth mentioning here that they belonged to 3 different women. There was Maria da Glória, 12 years old, future Queen of Portugal. She was the daughter of the late Empress Leopoldina, Dom Pedro's first wife. Then there was Isabel Maria, 8 years old, who was the daughter of Dom Pedro's most famous missus, Domitila de Castro, the Marquise of Santos. And the last one, and there was the soon-to-be-born Maria Amélia, daughter of his current wife, Amélia von Leuchtenberg. It's worth noting that the wife herself was only 19 years old. So, at home in Paris, Dom Pedro was constantly surrounded by the love of his 4 girls. No wonder he gave far more time to music and to his family than planning the invasion of Portugal in the company of ruthless mercenaries. Now, it was during this period of 6 months in Paris that Dom Pedro met another of his lifelong idols, the Italian composer Gioachino Rossini. But who was Rossini and what was he doing in Paris at the time? Gioachino Rossini was, without a shade of a doubt, the greatest opera composer of the first half of the 19th century. Until 1831, Rossini had already composed 39 operas, including the classic The Barber from Seville. His latest work, Guillaume Tell, was actually to be his last opera, as Rossini decided to retire that same year when he was only 39 years old, at the climax of his career. Rossini had arrived in Paris 7 years earlier when he was invited by King Louis XVIII to become a kind of official opera composer of the court. When the regime changed with the July Revolution in 1830, Rossini's contract was terminated and his payments were suspended. Now, in 1831, he was back in Paris for two very important reasons: to visit his Mrs. Olympe Pellissier and to negotiate with the new government the pension for life that Louis XVIII had promised to pay him. At the same time, Rossini was directing in Paris the Salle Favart, the home of the Royal Italian Theatre, or Théâtre des Italiens. It was there, after an opera performance, that Rossini met Dom Pedro and offered him an autographed music sheet. Dom Pedro, by his turn, took the chance to offer his own music to the famous Italian composer. That's how, in late October 1831, Rossini presented in the Théâtre des Italiens an overture composed by Dom Pedro, which was very likely the overture we are going to listen to now. Dom Pedro's Overture for Independence, executed by the Student Orchestra of the Federal University of Santa Catarina under the conduction of Ricardo Candy. Now, what was the reaction to Dom Pedro's music? Most of the Parisian press was positive about Dom Pedro's saga against his brother in Portugal. When it comes to Dom Pedro the composer, again, most of the press was very positive, including the periodicals specialized in music in France and abroad. Most reviews praised his overture and the way it was conducted. The English magazine The Harmonicon even said that Dom Pedro had conducted the orchestra himself, which I believe might be a mistake. Other French papers say that Dom Pedro conducted not the performance, but the rehearsals, which sounds more likely. Having said that, there was a part of the press, the legitimist side, who made strong opposition to King Louis-Philippe and his protégés. At least two main conservative papers, Le Figaro and La Mode, worth noticing is not the same Le Figaro as today, it's a different newspaper. Le Figaro and La Mode, they defended the Ancien regime, and they were ready to criticize Dom Pedro with mockery and sarcasm. One of them proclaimed, "Now we know why the Emperor Dom Pedro had to renounce. The Brazilians could not stand his music any longer." Another paper found a solution for the invasion of Portugal. "No need for war. It's enough to play Dom Pedro's music to expel Dom Miguel and his soldiers from Lisbon." Now, leaving aside the press irony, Rossini was indeed pleased with Dom Pedro's music. The evidence for that was revealed 24 years later, in 1855, when Rossini met the Austrian composer Sigismund Neukomm. The two men met in Trouville, Normandy, where Rossini was resting on the coast. The dialogue between them was registered by the German composer Ferdinand Hiller and published in the English magazine The Musical World. According to Hiller, Rossini asked if it was true that Noicon had lived in Brazil. Noicon said yes, he was a member of the French artistic mission in Rio de Janeiro, and he taught music to the young Prince Dom Pedro. I know him, said Rossini. I met him in Paris, and I played his music in the Théâtre des Italiens. It was well executed and obtained a very respectful amount of applause. So, Rossini, I think, was quite happy with the work of Dom Pedro. Now, if Dom Pedro hasn't become a famous composer, it was not for lack of talent, but lack of time. After winning the civil war in Portugal and regaining the crown for his daughter, now Queen Mary II, Dom Pedro died of tuberculosis at the age of 35. Still, in his short life, he managed to make Brazil independent. He abdicated 2 thrones and won a civil war against his own brother, not to mention the 21 children he fathered with his 2 wives and multiple lovers. If, on top of all that, he still composed quality music, I think Dom Pedro deserves our most sincere acknowledgement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this presentation. My friends, to close this conference, we will have a presentation by Mr. Mauricio Vicente Ferreira. As director of the Imperial Museum in Petropolis, Mr. Ferreira is responsible not only for this nomination, of which he has been working tirelessly for a very long time, but also for other important 19th century collections inscribed by Brazil in the Memory of the World program, such as the photographic collection of Dom Pedro II, son of Dom Pedro I, and the musical scores of Antonio Carlos Gomes, one of Brazil's greatest composers. Mr. Ferreira, please take the floor. Thank you.
So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here today. I would like to offer my sincere compliments to Mr. Santiago Irazabal Mourão, Brazilian ambassador to UNESCO. And also, Mr. Ambassador, many thanks for your sensible remarks about the tragedy that occurred yesterday in my city, down there in Petropolis, Brazil. Also, present my compliments to Mr. Faxon Banda, coordinator of UNESCO Memory of the World program, and to the professors Rosana Lancelotti, David Kramer, and Mauricio Assunção. I also present my acknowledgements to Brazilian diplomats responsible for this conference, César Barro, André Chermont, not here, unfortunately, and Alexandre too. And to my colleagues from the Museu Imperial in Petrópolis, Brazil, especially the researchers, Alessandra Fraguas and Cláudia Costa, and the graphic artist, Jorge Milek. The documentation proposed to the UNESCO International Memory of the World Register is composed by 11 documents, manuscripts, 8 music scores, and 3 letters, and 3 printed musical scores, totalizing 14 items related to the Dom Pedro de Alcântara, Emperor of Brazil as Dom Pedro I and King of Portugal as Dom Pedro IV. Here, the so-called the Monarch composer. The documents belong to 4 different public and private institutions in Brazil. The Cabildo Metropolitano do Rio de Janeiro, that belongs to the church, Biblioteca Alberto Nepomuceno, a Escola de Música da Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and to the Instituto Histórico Geográfico Brasileiro, and finally, to the Museu Imperial. The candidature represents the international circulation of liberal ideas in the early 19th century, the war against absolutism, and the historical contest of independence of Brazil and the constitutionalist ideas that based the Bragança's monarchies both in Portugal and Brazil. Before I start the formal presentation of this candidature, I'd like to give you a little background about our first emperor. Dom Pedro de Alcântara was the grandson of Queen Maria I and a son of King Dom João VI. He was born at Queluz Palace, Portugal, in 1798. He died in the same very room in 1834, the room named Dom Quixote. Here you can see his father, Dom João, and his mother, Dona Carlota Joaquina, at the time of their marriage in 1785. Carlota Joaquina was only 11 years old, and Dom João, 18 years old. Dom Pedro married twice. First with Dona Leopoldina of Habsburg, daughter of Francis I, Emperor of Austria, in 1817. Unfortunately, she died at the age of 29 in 1826. So 3 years later, in 1829, Dom Pedro married Dona Amélia of Leuchtenberg, who was in fact a daughter of Eugène de Beauharnais, son of Josephine, wife of Napoleon Bonaparte. Of the first marriage, 4 children have reached adult age. Dona Maria da Glória, who became Queen of Portugal, was the Dona Maria II. Dona Januária, who married the Count Áquila, Prince of Two Sicilies, and brother of the Empress Dona Teresa Cristina, wife of Dom Pedro II. Dona Francisca, who married Count of Joinville, son of French King Louis Philippe. And Dom Pedro de Alcântara, the second Brazilian emperor, as Dom Pedro II. A man of 2 continents, a monarch of 2 countries, and a composer of 2 worlds. Dom Pedro de Alcântara, the Emperor of Brazil and King of Portugal, is a historical agent who lived between 2 continents, Europe and South America, and 2 countries, Brazil and Portugal. Between his birth and death, there is an unusual life across the passage to the 19th century, a life that tells us so much about the liberal ideas inherited from the Illustration and the war against absolutism. Dom Pedro de Alcântara had declared the independence of Brazil in 1822, becoming its first emperor. However, he was also the heir of Portuguese throne. In this condition, he had abdicated in favor of his daughter, Dona Maria da Glória, in 1826, after his father's death. In the same way, in 1831, in Brazil, we renounced to the Brazilian throne in favor of his son, Dom Pedro, and returned to Europe. From Angra do Heroísmo, Dom Pedro organized a military combat against his brother, Dom Miguel. The liberal army, commanded by Dom Pedro, won the war after 2 years of combats. And finally, the constitutional monarch was installed in Portugal. So, the most notable signs of the documentation are the questions about the political dispute. The documents there contained reveal the relationship between culture and politics. The anthems that celebrate the victory of constitutionalist ideas can demonstrate the liberal ideas circulation and the Occidental network of intellectual sociability that involved the Emperor of Brazil and the heir of Portuguese throne. The manuscripts and original letters belonged to the Emperor Dom Pedro I personal archive, reveal a recognized monarch around Europe, not only because his political skills, but also because his attention to the arts and science, where the music had a privileged space. In Portugal and Brazil, Dom Pedro de Alcântara was trained in music by important scholars such as Diogo Garcia, José Totti, Luísa Pio, Father José Maria Nunes Garcia, Marcos Portugal, João Domingos Bom Tempo, and Sigismund von Neukomm. Dom Pedro de Alcântara was known as the Rei Orquestra, the orchestra king. He played 12 musical instruments and composed several works that become important references in musical catalogs. Among his compositions, there are religious music and, above all, political themes. In this sense, the documentation also points to the transition from sacred to profane arts, an important record of the construction of secular thought in 19th century. Dom Pedro de Alcântara's compositions were printed, and these anthems had circulated through Europe, from Portugal or Brazil to France, England, Germany, and Austria. More than an artistic composition, these anthems support a political idea. Then, the most historical significance of this documentation is the enlace between culture and politics. The related items are original documents, manuscripts, musical scores written by Dom Pedro I. Among them, there are musical scores copies, manuscripts, and ink produced between the 19th century and the beginning of 20th century. The main idiom in this documentation is Portuguese language, what reveals the political and cultural links between Brazil and Portugal, especially in the 19th century, when the independence of Brazil has been constructed. The letters, manuscripts, and ink belonging to the personal archive of the royal family of Portugal and imperial family of Brazil. They are original manuscripts items produced by Dom Pedro I during the contest of independence of Brazil. The most important one is the anthems of Brazil's independence, composed by Dom Pedro I in 1822, a truly landmark of the Brazilian history. The document was donated to the Instituto Histórico Geográfico Brasileiro on November 22nd, 1861, by Francisco Manuel da Silva, one of the most important Brazilian musicians of the 19th century. There are also printed items, dating from 19th century especially, with remarks. The circulation of these works spread Europe and America. On the other hand, these compositions reveal the scenario of rise of liberalism in early 19th century. There are marks of the manufacturers and providers of material supports that appear in the documentation. The patents and the logos of institutions are intrinsic elements seen with certain frequency in documentation and are important source for research, especially to those researchers specializing on the history of printing companies. The significance value of this candidature, Mr. Banda, to the world is based on a quite interesting aspect: the worldwide widespread of these compositions, even during the Dom Pedro lifetime. The international recognition of Dom Pedro's compositions, not only its political aspects, increase the social, community, and spiritual significance to the documents presented to this candidature. An example is the note published in London in 1830 by the English Reverend James Walsh, a Protestant preacher that traveled across Brazil during the 1820s. In these issues published in London, Paris, Lisbon, and Porto on the Portuguese constitutional anthem truly document the worldwide widespread of these compositions even during the Dom Pedro lifetime, as I said before. Also, Dom Pedro's compositions were recognized by important interlocutors. Among the manuscripts, there is a letter wrote by C.F. Miller, composer and teacher of Frederick Guillaume College in Berlin in 1829. The musical teacher at this important institution relates to the Emperor of Brazil how popular and recognized were in Prussia his compositions, and especially the Portuguese constitutional anthem. The year of 2022 offers an extremely important occasion to celebrate Dom Pedro I and Dom Pedro IV as a recognized composer of two worlds, America and Europe, because it marks the bicentennial of independence of Brazil. In addition, the documentation is presented in the subsequent commemoration of bicentennial of Maria da Gloria's birth. Maria da Gloria, who became Queen of Portugal as Mary II, oldest daughter of Dom Pedro of Brazil and Dona Leopoldina. There are anthems that celebrate the liberalism victory against the absolutist state in Portugal in the middle of 1820s. In this sense, Dom Pedro was metaphorically a composer of two reigns. The musical compositions presented by this candidature, Mr. Banda, represent a picture of this political and cultural scenario. So, the name of Dom Pedro de Alcântara and his compositions that remark this important moment, now celebrated in both bicentennial commemorations, offer a special opportunity to this candidature. A man of two continents, a monarch of two countries, a composer of two worlds, and music as an instrument of connection. For this reason, we propose this candidature to the UNESCO International Memory of World Register. Thank you very much. Merci.
Thank you very much, Mauricio Vicente. Thank you very much for this explanation. And my dear colleagues and friends, as we come to the conclusion of this conference, I would like to thank everyone involved in the preparation of this event, and most especially those responsible for the nomination of the dossier Dom Pedro de Alcântara, the Monarch composer, to UNESCO Memory of the World program. I would also like to thank the Secretariat of the program, especially Mr. Banda, for its support. Finally, as we all of you, I want to thank you, all of you, for your presence here, and we hope to meet you again soon in other events related to the celebration of the bicentennial of Brazilian independence. Thank you very much. Muito bom.
Muito bom.
Obrigado, viu?
Foi ótimo. Obrigada a você pela hospedagem.